Good evening, and welcome to the regular meeting of the Board of Education for October 29, 2018. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll?
Mrs. Bradford?
Here.
Mrs. Burton?
Here.
Mr. Centers?
Here.
Mrs. Frank?
Here.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Here.
Mrs. Bonnefield is here. President Johnson?
Here. We have a quorum. Mrs. Burton, would you help us with the Pledge of Allegiance,
Yes.
please?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Again, good evening, and welcome to our regular meeting, or what we call a voting meeting of the Board of Education. If you want to follow along with our agenda, we have agendas outside of the door to my left, and it's just around the corner. You can pick those up and follow along. If you're watching from home, you can go to our website, which is livoniapublicschools.org, highlight over the board tab, and if you drop down to the agendas, you can see those. Also, anyone who wants to address the board tonight during our audience communication, you need a blue slip. And those blue slips are also on the table outside of the door. Again, this is a voting meeting, and if you're here to listen to a lot of discussion, you probably won't hear it tonight, because the items that are on the agenda have already been discussed by the board at least 2 times in a study session, and more likely with greater discussion at our committee of the whole. But tonight you won't hear a whole lot of discussion because we've gone over a lot of these as we've gone through. We do have a couple of really good items on the agenda tonight, and Mrs. Jenkins will be here to help us with our communications. One thing that I always like to do, and it's sort of become my habit since I've become the board, is I like to go over our district climate goal. And it reads, all students will experience a positive, safe, and welcoming environment where both students and adults respect and value one another. That's one thing that we try and instill in our community around Livonia. It's between student to student, adult to adult, and student to adult. We as the board take that very seriously. We can have disagreements and difference of opinions, but we always respect each other and our viewpoints. And we do that not only here at the board, but we do that with the audience, and we would hope that you follow the same respect when you address the board. It makes everybody a little more happy. So tonight we're going to go ahead and start with our communications. Mrs. Jenkins, we'll start with item 3A, Gift to Special Education Program. Good evening.
Okay, good evening, President Johnson, members of the board, Superintendent Oquist. As you know, our school district is fortunate to have community support that comes in many different ways. Whether it's from local nonprofits or local businesses, the support is generous and it is very much appreciated. Tonight we're recognizing a local realtor named Donnie Orlando for his generosity. At this time, I'd like to invite Mr. Orlando, along with Mrs. Beth Santer, who is a special education coordinator, to join me at the podium. Take that long trek up to the podium. Mrs. Santer has been working with Mr. Orlando for several months on a program in which the district's special education programs will receive donations from Mr. Orlando's home sales within the city of Livonia. He has generously offered to donate 20% of his commission on any home that is sold in Livonia to our special education programs. Tonight we're recognizing the first donation, and according to Mr. Orlando, the first of many to come. I would like to present the following certificate of appreciation to Mr. Orlando and to his business, Orlando Holmes, Keller Williams, for the generous donation of $976.50 to the district's special education programs. And the certificate reads, Livonia Public Schools Certificate of Appreciation, Donnie Orlando, for the financial donation to the special education programs at Livonia Public Schools. Dated October 29th, 2018, signed by Superintendent Andrea Oquist. And I'll present that to you. Thank you very much. And at this time, I'd like to invite Mrs. Santer to tell you a little bit of the background for this very generous program.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight about Donnie and his donation program. I have known Donnie Orlando and his lovely wife Kathy for many years. They are residents of Livonia, members of our school district, and they have a connection with our special education programs. Over the years, I've spent many hours discussing and hearing the appreciation of the positive impact Livonia's special education programs have had for Donnie and Kathy's family. We know that any family that has children in school has these kind of conversations about schools with other families all the time. However, when you have children with special needs, those conversations happen more frequently, and the connections between these families can be lifelines. So when Donnie approached me about wanting to give back to our programs, I was thrilled but not surprised. Donnie has always been grateful for our programs and wanted that gratitude to naturally extend to giving back. I am so appreciative that Donnie is donating to our special education programs, and I am sure that it will be the first of many that his donation program will contribute. And at this point, I know Donnie wanted to say a few words. I'm going to turn it over to him.
Thank you, everybody. I wanted to say thank you for the recognition. My wife and I have been a resident in Livonia for 20 years, and we really appreciate everything that the Livonia Public School System has done for myself and my family, and hope through future sales we can bring more donations to the Livonia Public School System and the special education program. So I thank you again for everything you've done for my family. Thank you.
Mrs. Jenkins, I just wanted to note that we're going to take a short recess after item C3 so that we can congratulate our folks tonight. Okay. Any comments from the board?
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes, just thank you so much. There's so many parents who donate their time, their resources in various ways, and this you've obviously found a very unique way that involves your family specifically, as so many have. But this is obviously a very unique gift. And we're just very thankful. We have a lot of businesses that contribute in various ways, some as one-time gifts, some as more regular occurrences, but we're just thrilled. And thank you so much for the recognition of this very, very important program. Special education in Livonia Public Schools is known throughout many communities, which we've learned as board members as we've traveled outside of our district and throughout the state. But Livonia Public Schools special education is known through many, many communities, and it's wonderful to see parents who have had such a positive experience and want to give back to the program. So thank you so very much.
Thank you. Okay, that'll take us to item 3B. A gift to the MOCI program at Emerson Middle School, and let's get a motion going before we do anything else. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson?
Mrs. Burke.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the generous donation of $1,000 from Peter and Wissam Corey to the Special Education MOCI program at Emerson Middle School.
Support.
We have motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Bonnefield. Mrs. Jenkins.
Thank you, President Johnson. The gifts just keep on coming tonight, which is wonderful. Tonight it's my pleasure to recognize and to thank a special couple for their generous donation to the MOCI program at Emerson Middle School. I would like to invite Peter and Wissam Corey to join me at the podium. Good evening.
Good evening.
The Coreys have generously donated $1,000 to the MOCI program for students with special needs. They felt compelled to make this donation for any classroom supplies or materials that may be needed to help the students in their learning. They are familiar with MOCI, which services students with moderate cognitive impairments, because their daughter, Michelle Salah, is a parapro, and their granddaughter, Megan, is a speech therapist at Emerson, and they're both in the audience this evening. They have the Coreys have 10 grandchildren, and they've always been involved in their upbringing and in their education. 3 of their grandchildren attended Livonia Public Schools and are now adults, but the Coreys were always very impressed by all of the different activities their grandchildren experienced in LPS through the years. Children with special needs have always held a spot in their hearts. Prior to their retirement, the Coreys owned restaurants and would often host dinners for families with families of children with special needs. It would give them great joy to provide a warm meal and friendly company to the families. Seeing the pride that Michelle and Megan take in their work in the MOCI program at Emerson, the Coreys decided this would be the perfect way to give back to the school district. In the audience tonight, we're joined by Michelle, Megan, and also Kimberly Colazzi, and Kimberly's partner in crime, Casey Loisel, from the MOCI program, and also by Mrs. Santer, who oversees the program. I'd like to invite Mrs. Santer to say a few words after presenting the following certificate of appreciation, which reads, Livonia Public Schools Certificate of Appreciation, Peter and Wissam Corey, for the generous $1,000 donation to the MOCI program at Emerson Middle School, dated October 29th, 2018, and signed by Superintendent Andrea Oquist. And there you go. Thank you very much.
I'm so happy to have Mr. and Mrs. Corey with us tonight so that we can honor them publicly for their donation to the Emerson MOCI program. Mr. and Mrs. Corey were generous enough to donate to our program without any expectation other than to help our students. This is the kind of selfless act that is humbling. We are so appreciative of their generous gift, and we will use it for our students as they intended. I am thrilled that you're able to share this moment with your lovely daughter, Michelle, who's one of our amazing paraprofessionals, as well as their granddaughter, Megan, who's one of our wonderful speech pathologists. All of us who work with Michelle and Megan see how they give so beautifully to our students every day and clearly embody the spirit of giving that you have passed on to them. And as I arrived here tonight, I wasn't expecting this, but in true Kimberly Clazy and Casey Loisel fashion, they had the students make a card that has their picture, all of their names signed, and then on the back, because you gave $1,000, they had each student say what they would do if they had $1,000. How would they spend it? And there's a lot of great answers on here. We have Barbies, a new watch, we have chicken nuggets, french fries, so there's a lot of things that this money will be used for. So I know you appreciated the certificate, but you might even like this a little bit more. So there you go. Thank you so much. And would you like to say a few words? Okay, great.
I never knew about what was happening with the special education program until I had a cup of coffee with my daughter, Michelle, and she explained to me about the personal sacrifices that these special ed teachers make. With that said, I think you guys should think about giving them a raise. But it's our pleasure, and thank you so much for this honor.
Thank you.
Questions or comments from the board?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
As a parent of a special needs child, I certainly understand the sacrifices that you make. I see it every day when I go into my son's school. He went through Webster when he was younger. He's now 25. And the parapros in his school, you can't get better folks. And I'm so appreciative. Thank you. Okay, we have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Bonifield. Would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonifield says yes. Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
President Johnson?
Yes. Motion carries. Thank you again. All right, that takes us to item 3C, district update from the superintendent. Mrs. Oquist.
Thank you, President Johnson, and thank you so much to our special guests who are here this evening for your generosity and for sharing of your time and talent and care with our children and our staff. Thank you. We also have late-breaking news for the update, so that's wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Wallenberg. I have a number of items, Mr. Johnson, but I will move through them quickly. School is underway.
You have 3 minutes, Mrs.
3 minutes, okay, I got it. We'd like to give a big congratulations to Hoover Elementary, who is the first school in Michigan to achieve green flag school status by the National Wildlife Foundation. You may remember that Hoover and their Eco Action team were here last year as one of our points of pride. They shared their sustainability efforts and have been working very, very hard to achieve this green flag school status. They have now done so and again are the first in Michigan. So we congratulate them for this very special distinction. We'd like to acknowledge a number of our musicians this evening. We have 3 very talented vocalists from Stevenson High School, McCade Ferguson, Emilia Smick, and Easton Uriel, all of whom were accepted into the Michigan School Vocal Music Association's Regional Honors Choir, which is quite an accomplishment. They will perform with the Regional Honors Choir in December with the hopes of securing a spot in the State Honors Choir. So congratulations to all of these wonderful vocalists. 11 of our Frost band students were selected to participate in the 2018 Wayne State University Honors Band Day that was held on Saturday, October 6th. There were over 160 nominations at the middle school level, and 11 LPS students were accepted. So I will just go through the first names, so hopefully they know who they are. From Frost Middle School: Catherine, Miles, Hunter, Nellie, Noel, Michael, Abeline, Olivia S., Ray, Olivia T., and Henry. Congratulations to them and to their teacher, Michael Reyes, for this great opportunity. Also on the music front, the Franklin Marching Band joins an elite group of bands who have earned a trip to the state finals at Ford Field. So Saturday, November 3rd, that's this Saturday. If you're not busy, get up early and join them. Performance time is at 8 a.m. So we wish them much luck. Some of you may have had a chance to see, I know we've shared it on some of our social media, and it was on Channel 4. One of our amazing high school students from Churchill, Grant Sobchak, was featured recently for his involvement in a Young Entrepreneurs Academy through the Dearborn Chamber of Commerce for his work on 2 startup companies that were highlighted. We've highlighted Grant and some of his accomplishments before, and we continue to be wildly proud of his ingenuity and his efforts. If you are not busy, I could fill up your Saturdays, but here's another great suggestion. The 5th annual Blessings in a Backpack Bowling Day is taking place on Saturday, November 10th. This is open to any member of the school community who would like to support the tremendous work that Blessings in a Backpack does. Blessings in a Backpack provides food for students to take home who are in need, literally provides for hundreds of students at multiple LPS schools in our district. The event will take place from 2 to 4 p.m. If you are a bowler, it's $20. If you are not a bowler but a supporter, it is $10. They'll have a silent auction and would love for you to join them. Also this Saturday, I told you I could fill up the Saturdays. Also this Saturday is the Frost PTSA Craft Show. I think they're going on year... Who said that? Awesome. Year 42. So that's pretty impressive. That is always a mark your calendar date for members of the community. It's $3 to enter. Bring a couple extra dollars. I heard the baked good donations are looking fine. So we'd like to congratulate a youngster from Johnson Elementary, Kate Evanoff, for her brave actions that provided essential emergency medical support to her mom during a recent situation. Kate was surprised with a special award by the Canton Police Department for her bravery and action, and her proud family and all of the Johnson Jayhawks were there to see the special recognition in her honor. So way to go, Kate. Finally, a few athletic highlights. We just wrapped up a fantastic fall sports season, and we are already on to winter, if you can believe it. Churchill boys and girls cross country are both Livonia City and KLAA East Division champions. Varsity football, you may have heard the roars around town this past Friday. 2 of our schools made it into the MHSAA state playoffs, or the state playoff qualifiers. Franklin will continue into the playoffs this Friday at home against Bedford, so go Pats. Join us at 7 p.m. for a great game. Churchill Volleyball won the KLAA East Division Championship in a hard-fought game against Stevenson. I think they had the biggest crowd of supporters has ever been seen at a game. So a tremendous support from both Churchill and Stevenson. Great crowds and community support. Franklin Volleyball competes in the first rounds of districts tonight, so good luck to them. And finally, tryouts for winter sports are just around the corner. They've been conditioning for basketball and hockey and cheer, and our newly added bowling. So bowling tryouts are coming up, and we are so excited to have our 3 boys varsity teams, our 3 girls varsity teams, and we can't wait to catch some bowling action. Is that what it's called? Bowling
Meat? No.
meets?
No.
Bowling matches, thank you, from help from my friends to the right, at Mary Bowl this winter. So tremendous things going on academically, artistically, athletically, throughout Livonia Public Schools. So thank you to our tremendous staff and, of course, to our awesome students. That's it, President Johnson. That's it.
Thank you, Mrs. Elquist.
You are welcome.
And as I indicated, we are going to take just a short recess, and we'll be back in about 5 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, man, what did you call it?
Meats?
evening, and we are back from our recess, so we will move on with our agenda tonight. That'll take us to item 3D, written communications. I do not have any written communications. Does the board have any? Seeing none, that'll move us to item 3E, audience communication. Just as a reminder, under audience communication, each speaker is limited to 3 minutes. We do have a timer, and we feel that using the timer is a little better than me banging on the gavel to stop someone. So we'd ask when you get to your 3 minutes, you'll hear the sound and to wrap up your comments. Also, I wanted to advise that if you're looking for a response to your audience communication, the board is responsible for 3 specific areas. That is policy, our hiring and evaluation of the superintendent, and our long-term strategic planning and aligning the budget to those plans. So if you're looking for a response and it involves any one of those 3 areas, you can expect a response from the board. If your item revolves around anything else that deals with the day-to-day operations of the district, then you can expect a response from our administration, and that would most likely be Mrs. Oquist. I only have 2 blue slips. The first one is a Bradley Bonifield. Good evening, Brad. How are you?
Good evening. Well, thanks for your time. As a resident of Livonia, I am proud to be represented by such an excellent school board. While what I am espousing will be classed as speaking to the choir, I still feel it needs to be spoken. I am concerned with the judicial finding from the Michigan Court of Appeals that has upheld a pair of state budget appropriations that reimburse private schools for the cost of fire drills, inspections, and other state requirements. While proponents state this is to keep school children safe as determined by state requirements, the truth is the Michigan Constitution clearly states that no public money shall be directly or indirectly aid or maintain parochial and other private schools. In 1970, Michigan voters approved this amendment to Michigan's Constitution. Since then, courts have interpreted the amendment to try and bypass its desired effect to the benefit of non-public schools. Even our state representative, Laura Cox, voted yes to authorize charter schools to collect revenues from enhancement millages. Laura Cox is no friend of public education when she states that public schools are more than adequately funded and school boards need to use their dollars more efficiently. You may think this is small potatoes. I initially did so also, until someone wiser than I stated that it is a slippery slope we are treading. In 1791, Thomas Jefferson established the USA as the first country to implement separation of church and state in the First Amendment. To this day, there still are only a handful of countries that truly support this ideal. This is an ideal worth fighting for, and thus my determination to keep it this way in our great state of Michigan. Even now, we still have states in the USA teaching creationism in schools using public funding, such as Arizona, Arkansas, Colorado, Florida, Georgia, Indiana, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, Washington, D.C., Wisconsin, and even Ohio. Just take a short drive down I-75 and you will even find a large boat called an Ark supported with public funds. This issue I speak of is not a bipartisan issue, but a core ideal of the USA. I support the right of anyone to their inherent freedoms protected by the Constitution. My concern is the chipping away of any ideal, especially one so critical to the survival of this country. My desire is to work at the local level, and in this I ask you to continue to support public schools and hopefully convince the state that public education is woefully funded. Just like our public roads, school funding is a second thought. It's not a priority. Public school funding needs to be a priority in Michigan. Thank you for your time. Like I said, hopefully I'm talking to the choir, but thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bonifield. I have a second blue slip from Audrey Rogers. Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
My name is Audrey Rogers. I'm a proud parent to 3 LPS students. I speak to you now with the goal of bringing awareness to a matter of privacy violations that have flown under the radar in Michigan public schools, including Livonia public schools, for far too long. After bringing these matters before several administrators several weeks ago, I am happy to report that one part of the problem has been rectified by asking parents for consent before sharing student educational records with a third party. These records are federally protected under the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, or FERPA. The third party in this case is the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services through their Michigan Care Improvement Registry, as well as the local health departments. Unfortunately, these violations are not yet resolved for families who wish to maintain their privacy. In fact, families, including our own, are being forced to give up our privacy rights with the threat and reality that our child would be excluded from school, even though we have met state law requirements. Parents should not be forced to give up one right of privacy protected under FERPA, for another right, the right to a free, appropriate public education. MDHHS is aware of these situations. Yet they continue to direct Michigan school districts to follow policy that violates FERPA and essentially the constitutional Fourth Amendment rights of LPS families. They are also careless in their concern for the district's potential loss of federal funding due to these violations. The Fourth Amendment states this: the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue, but upon the probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. I had the opportunity to speak with Mr. Archibald and Mrs. Oakwest last Friday. They were both very receptive of my concerns and assured me their desire to maintain transparency with LPS families, and agreed to look into these matters in the coming weeks. Other states such as Ohio, Wisconsin, and Indiana have gone before us in creating systems and policies that bring state law and federal law into harmony. I look forward to coming alongside LPS as our district leads Michigan into the same harmony that these other states have found. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Yeah. I do not have any other more blue slips. Or is there anyone else in the audience that wants to address the board tonight? Seeing none, we will then move on in our agenda to item 3F, response to prior audience communication. I do not have any. Does the board have any response to prior communications? Seeing none, we will move on to item 4, our consent agenda. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Frank.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the following consent agenda items as recommended by the superintendent. 5A, minutes of the regular meeting of September 24th, 2018. 5B, minutes of the closed session of September 24th, 2018. 5C, minutes of the special meeting of October 8th, 2018. 7A, approval of the 2018-2019 Adult Education Program of Studies.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mrs. Bradford. Are there any questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mrs. Bradford. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
I would. Okay. Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes, that motion carries. Thank you. That will take us then to item 7A.
6A.
I'm sorry, 6A, Upper Elementary Assistant Principal Appointment. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Burton.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the superintendent and appoint Thomas Traub as assistant principal at Johnson Upper Elementary beginning November 5th, 2018.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Jarvis.
Mr. Archibald.
Mr. Archibald's going to handle that.
He's going to get us started, yes.
Thank you.
All right. Good evening, and thank you, Mr. Johnson. Before we start, I'd like to thank Mrs. Scott, who led the first and second round interviews, as well as the central office and building administrators who were part of the screening and interview process. We had over 90 applicants for this position, and Mr. Traub was selected from a very strong and competent pool of applicants. Most notably in his accomplishments, he is a graduate of Churchill High School. Mr. Traub has an associate's degree from the Seminole State College in Florida. He has a bachelor's degree and a master's degree from the University of Central Florida. He brings back to Michigan nearly 10 years of experience, including that as an elementary classroom teacher, an instructional coach at the district level, and also most recently an assistant principal in Florida. Mr. Traub relocated with his family back to Michigan just this past summer, and we had the good fortune of hiring him as an instructional coach with LPS this past August. It has always been his desire and aspiration to be an administrator at Johnson Elementary School, and lo and behold, that happened probably a little sooner than, probably not soon enough for him according to our conversations, but certainly very soon nonetheless. So we are delighted to have Mr. Traub being recommended tonight to fill this very important role. I'll turn it back over to Mrs. Oquist.
Thank you, Mr. Archibald. We are thrilled, Board of Education colleagues, as you know, to be bringing this recommendation to you. Johnson Elementary is a very special school community, and we had the opportunity just a few short weeks ago to make the recommendation for Mr. Rob Witherspoon, the prior assistant principal at Johnson and longtime member of that school community, to take over at the helm at Cleveland, which left the vacancy as part of the dynamic duo leadership team at Johnson. And so we were thrilled to have such a tremendous response at this time of year to the job posting to begin with. Certainly, the quality of the applicants included many with extensive administrative experience. We were thrilled to have someone of Mr. Traub's character and background to consider as part of this. So Mr. Archibald shared that he is a Churchill Charger, but you may also know that he was a Johnson Jayhawk. And so Mr. Traub also attended Johnson Elementary School and is very familiar with the community, with the school, and is absolutely thrilled to be coming back to his roots. But I don't want to take too much of what may be his words of welcome. And so we'd like to recommend this evening Mr. Traub for his instructional expertise, his commitment to the students and staff that he serves, and his enthusiasm to take on this leadership role within our great district, and certainly to serve the wonderful community of Johnson. So we'd like to make that recommendation to you this evening, and also thank all of our friends from Johnson who are here with us this evening. That means such a great deal to have you here.
Thank you, Mrs. Oquist.
You're welcome.
I think we're going to go ahead and vote. Is there any questions or comments first? Mr. Centers.
Well, I was in high school with Tom, and so I don't have any embarrassing stories. Maybe a couple, but I will refrain. But I would also like to point out that myself, Allison, and Tom all had Mr. Archibald as a principal. I do this, one, to highlight his age, but two, to say that Livonia Public Schools is definitely a special place, and all of us were really drawn to come back to it. So this is yet again another example of people returning home, trying to get back. So we're it's great to have Tom here, and I think he's going to be a great principal. So that's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Centers. Any other questions or comments? Not at this time. All right, so we have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, to approve the upper elementary assistant principal. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Burton,
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis,
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford,
Yes.
Mr. Centers,
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes, motion carries. Congratulations.
Thank you, Mr. Centers, I appreciate that. To the board members, thank you, guys. I can't thank you enough for that final vote. It means the world to me. Ms. O'Quist, Mr. Archibald, Mr. Willenborg, Ms. Scott, everyone a part of the interview team. It was just amazing to sit down and talk with you. I enjoyed our conversations, and I am so thrilled to be the AP at Johnson, and I'm looking forward to serving this community more than anything. I'd like to say a special thank you to Teresa O'Brien and Mr. Keith McDonald. This summer, we decided to come back home. This is home. My wife and I, both born and raised in Livonia, decided to apply for 2 jobs in Livonia, and when that happened, it's not easy moving 3 kids under the age of 6 across country, but at the same time, between flights and U-Hauls and appointments, Keith and Teresa were there every step of the way to make sure everything was in order, kids were registered for school, we were settled in and ready to go by September. So Miss O'Brien, Mr. McDonald, we appreciate everything you guys did for us. To the Johnson community, the staff, the students, the community members, I'm home. As a kid who grew up at Wayne and Joy, this just means the world to me to come home and to serve the back where I grew up. This is my roots. This is where I am. This is who I am. I can't thank Principal Deanna so much for everything. Glad to see a bunch of Johnson teachers here tonight. I can't thank you all for everything. This is a great sign of support. I look forward to serving all of you and helping you with whatever you may need in the next coming future here. Finally, most importantly, my wife and my 3 children. I'm down to 1 right now. The other 2 are not here, but good girl, Madison. My oldest, unfortunately, is under the weather right now, and my youngest is 10 months, so he's in the hallway right now. So we just are thankful for everything. To my wife, thank you for supporting me, moving cross-country for a second time in a short span. Just the love and support I receive at home is just a reflection of what I bring to the table, and I can't thank you enough for everything. Thank you. To everyone, I'm glad to be home. I'm glad to serve. Thank you, Livonia Public Schools. Let's get to work.
All right. We will now move on to item 6B, teacher for approval. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mr. Centers.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the superintendent and offer employment for the 2018-19 school year to the teacher listed on the attached document.
Support?
We have a motion by Mr. Centers, supported by Mrs. Bonnefield. Are there any questions? I'm sorry, Mrs. Burton. Okay. Any questions or comments?
No.
Nope. Seeing none? All right, do you have something to add, Mr. Archibald?
Always. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. This teacher has been interviewed along with other qualified applicants for the vacancy that existed in our instructional program. We believe this teacher is the most qualified for the position and recommend that this individual be approved for employment.
Thank you, Mr. Archibald. Questions or comments from the board? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mr. Centers, supported by Mrs. Burton for the approval of teacher. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes, the motion carries. Thank you. That will take us to item 6C, granting of tenure status to teachers. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Bradford.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the superintendent and acknowledge that tenure status be granted to the following teachers effective on the respective dates. Jessica Cuscu, October 15th,
2018. Aaron Winslow, October 15th, 2018.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Bradford, supported by Mr. Centers. Mr. Archibald.
Yes, I'd just like to confirm that the teachers named have successfully met the requirements for a probationary teacher to be granted tenure. These requirements include years of service and job performance, as indicated through the annual evaluation process. And as such, we're asking that the Board of Education acknowledge that, again, these two individuals have achieved tenure status.
Thank you, Mr. Archibald. Questions or comments from the board? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Bradford, supported by Mr. Centers, to grant tenure status to teachers. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Sorry. You guys. Mr. Centers is yes. Okay. Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes, motion carries.
Okay.
Well, every once in a while, we have one of these meetings that
Can you go check and see that the door is open? If the
somebody's
doors
checking.
are
Somebody's
okay
checking.
already. Okay.
Okay.
We have possibly have a skunk out
Yeah,
outside,
there-
so that's
yeah,
what was the distraction.
We're getting a draft in here of a rather pungent odor. We'll get through it.
We're on it. I think skunk
Okay.
contributing to audience communication.
All right, that'll take us to item 6D, leave of absence. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Jarvis.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the superintendent and approve the request for a leave of absence as listed below. Lisa Fritz, effective date November 2nd, 2018.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mr. Centers. Are you still here, Mr. Archibald?
I'm still here. Rank has its, or seniority has its privileges, perhaps. I'm not running down a skunk. Just would like to confirm that this request for leave is in accordance with the LEA collective bargaining agreement, and as such, we're requesting that the leave be approved as requested for the 2018-19 school year.
Thank you, Mr. Archibald. Any questions or comments from the board? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mr. Centers, to accept leave of absence. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes, motion carries. That'll take us to item 6E, resolutions of appreciation for employees who are retiring. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mrs. Bonnefield.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District adopt the attached resolutions of appreciation for the services rendered by Jeffrey Armstrong, Kathleen Coggins, Elizabeth Danko, Donna Dunn, Diane Gallup, Daniel Walters.
Support.
We have, is that Mrs. Frank? We have a motion.
No, it was Mrs. Jarvis.
No, it was Mrs. Frank.
Mrs.
Oh.
Frank.
Sorry.
We have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Frank. Mr. Archibald.
Yes, tonight we bring before you the names of 6 individuals who will be retiring. These individuals leave the district with a combined 129 years of experience with Livonia Public Schools. On behalf of the district, I'd like to thank each of these individuals for their years of dedicated and unwavering service to the students of Livonia Public Schools, and ask that the board adopt the attached resolutions of appreciation in their honor.
Thank you, Mr. Archibald. Questions or comments from the board?
Congratulations.
Yes.
Thank you.
Congratulations and thank you.
Mrs. Oquist.
President Johnson, we have a tremendous group of retirees this evening. I'd like to make special note. Mrs. Coggins is the team leader at Randolph Elementary in our center. And you may recall a few weeks ago I shared an email with you and an update that Mrs. Coggins had literally saved the life of a student. So we had a student that had a medical emergency and who was no longer conscious, conscious or breathing. She performed CPR for a number of minutes and provided those life-saving measures, and we are so grateful for her actions and those of the rest of the staff. But we often refer to our staff as lifesavers, and in this particular case, that moniker certainly fits for Mrs. Coggins. So we wish them all well and thank them for their dedication to LPS.
Thank you, Mrs. Oak.
You're welcome.
Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Frank. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
President Johnson?
Yes, motion carries, and again, congratulations and good luck in the
Happy
next chapter.
retirement.
Yes.
All right, that will then take us to item 7B, approval to purchase guided reading materials. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Jarvis?
move that the Board of Education purchase literacy footprints, guided reading materials, and 5 days of professional development from Pioneer Valley Books for a total cost of $222,328.
Support.
There's a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mrs. Frank. Mrs. O'Brien, you going to help us with this?
I am, yes.
Thank you.
This evening, we are coming to you requesting the purchase of Literacy Footprints guided reading program for our K-4 classrooms. These materials support our classrooms with fiction and nonfiction leveled text. The materials are aligned with Jan Richardson's Next Step to Guided Reading, which is a program we've been using for the past several years. These materials were piloted last year, along with another guided reading program, and teachers overwhelmingly supported the literacy footprints. They noted that the materials were more engaging. They thought the font size and the pictures were appropriate for age levels that lower L had larger font size than the other program. Supported teachers' ability to target their instruction based on student needs, and it saved them instructional time when planning for their the needs of their students. The materials come with leveled text, 100 titles for kindergarten, 130 titles for first grade, 91 for second, 62 titles for third grade, and 60 titles for fourth grade. These materials will support our district goal of improved student growth and achievement with a priority on elementary reading achievement. This purchase also includes 5 days of professional development, and the materials will be rolled out by grade level with the professional development for each grade level to support their implementation. The total purchase is $222,328 and will be from the elementary textbook account.
Thank you, Mrs. O'Brien. Questions or comments from the board? Mr. Centers?
So, Mrs. O'Brien, this can be a great resource for our teachers who, especially at the elementary level, have lots of different preps during the day, right? A lot of different subjects to get preparation for, a lot of different learning levels. But according to a student's level, they can pull a lesson, pull a set of books, and corresponding skills that would go along with that particular level have lessons mapped out for them, right? So this can be one, a great resource to the teachers, but also can ensure some consistency across classrooms. Is that the goal?
Correct. So it provides continuity and consistency. So at each level, the textbooks, the leveled texts go in an order, building the skills to prepare students for the next level of reading. It follows Jan Richardson's model, which we have been using with all of the wonderful books we have in our book rooms currently. But these books then come with that lesson plan, just like you explained, Mr. Centers. So it comes sequenced so that teachers have that order of skills to build students up.
Sure. And along those lines, there's still room for teachers to differentiate or really kind of improvise where they think is important or right for the students.
So students still have different needs. We diagnose those needs with, like iReady shows students' strengths. So I might be reading at a level M, but maybe I have some vocabulary holes. So it gives us another tool, another way for teachers to meet student needs.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Thank you. Mrs. O'Brien, these books will supplement and work with the leveled libraries that many of our schools already have in place?
Yep, so our leveled libraries don't come with the specific skills and vocabulary to pull out. Teachers have been doing that on their own with all of the books in their book room, their leveled book room. So these come already pre-planned, so it saves the teacher time. But they certainly have the ability to use all the books that they have in their book room in addition.
Thank you. Mrs. Burton.
Mrs. O'Brien, you talked about the number of different titles at each grade level. We talked about this at our committee of the whole, but for the benefit of the public, can you refresh the number of total books we're purchasing? Or at least by grade level? Because we're talking about not simply a few titles of each book. I mean, we're talking about many copies of each title.
Correct. So you get 6 copies. There's 100 titles at kindergarten, 130 titles at first grade, 91 titles at second grade, 62 titles at third, and 60 titles at fourth. So 6 books of each one of those titles. So a school set, has more than 300, almost 400 books. 6 copies of each of those titles.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Fiction and nonfiction.
Great. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Ms. O'Brien, can you explain a little bit more what's included with the PD?
Yes, so someone from Literacy Footprints is going to walk our teachers through using the program, how to follow the sequence of books. So that would be something new, since we typically go to our book room and choose books that, teachers choose themselves, and then they identify those skills in those books. What books lend themselves to what kind of vocabulary. Literacy Footprints has it all laid out for a teacher, so the PD will help provide that scaffolding so a teacher sees the importance of that. And then we are adopting or bringing in each grade level at a time. So we're going to start with second grade and have the professional development, give them their materials, and then the literacy coaches can work with second grade teachers to implement, get them going, and then we'll have professional development for the next grade level, and we'll roll them out each grade level at a time.
Okay, great, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mrs. Frank, for the approval to purchase guided reading materials. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll?
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes, thank you. That motion carries. That'll move us on to item 8, business matters. And 8A is approval to retain Foresight Design for completion of athletic field projects at Franklin and Stevenson High Schools. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mr. Centers.
Move that the Livonia Public Schools School District Board of Education approve the recommendation of the owner's representative, Plant Moran Cressa, to award the contract for design work of Franklin High School and Stevenson High School athletic fields, replacement projects to Foresight Design, Berkeley, Michigan, for a total estimated cost of $99,000 based upon 4.5% of hard cost construction estimated amounts, and authorize the superintendent or her designee to negotiate and execute final contract.
Support.
We have a motion by Mr. Centers, supported by Mrs. Bradford. Mr. Francis, help us with this?
Yes, President Johnson. The work provided by Foresight, they have been engaged currently, and previously I should say, on the Churchill Athletic Field project. And this work that they have done and that we're proposing to re-engage them with the Stevenson and Franklin projects includes design work, some project oversight, helping represent the district with regard to post-bid interviews, pre-bid estimates. All of this type of work is wrapped around this particular contract. So they would be with the district from design through the punch list and everywhere in between. And the sinking fund team, as we've worked together on different projects, we have worked with Foresight through the Churchill project. We've been very satisfied with their work. Their design was excellent. Their knowledge of the industry is excellent, and finishing off the project through the summer. They were, are there for us and representing the district all along the way. So we do recommend re-engaging them for the Stevenson and Franklin projects that will actually occur during the summer of 2019.
Thank you, Mr. Francis. Questions or comments from the board? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mr. Centers, supported by Mrs. Bradford, for the approval to retain Foresight Design for completion of athletic field projects at Franklin and Stevenson High Schools. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson?
Yes. Motion carries. That will take us to item 8B, approval to purchase equipment for Churchill High School Technology Collaboration Room, 2013 bond. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Bradford.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District authorize the purchase of technology equipment for Churchill High School from VSC Incorporated, Novi, Michigan, in the amount of $40,678.89.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Bradford, supported by Mrs. Jarvis. Mr. Francis, you going to help us out with this one, too?
Yes, sir. This is a bond fund project at Churchill High School, and the creation of the Technology Collaboration Room at the school is actually going to serve as a pilot program. And what we intend to do is have the room designed, first of all, with the input from administration and teachers. As we move forward, they were very excited to have a room like this designed for them. The idea behind the room is for a flexible space with opportunities for collaboration, small group work, presentation, different opportunities for students in classes, again, whether it be as a whole as a presentation style or whether they were broken into groups, to use modern technology in a project-based environment. And again, this is something that we as a district are looking at as a forerunner or pilot for the other potentially secondary schools to see based upon the success and usage. And if what I'm hearing from some of the teachers and administrators is accurate, it's going to get the usage because they're already excited and planning on it.
Thank you, Mr. Francis. Questions or comments? Mr. Centers.
I just want to highlight a couple of the pieces of technology that are a part of this. The largest expenditure is for 75-inch interactive smart learning suites, they call it, but they're essentially like large screens, televisions almost like, that are interactive, like a smart board.
Correct.
We also have a projector in here. Those are really the largest purchases here, but there will be 6 interactive boards, so a variety of different groups can work together.
Just to give a feel for those at home, and it's hard when you're just hearing the description, but you have a double, 2 former classrooms, so a double long room, so a very long room that will have 6 of these 75-inch interactive TV screens that are hooked in and will be mounted above furniture so that students can work in small breakout groups, each group with their own interactive screen that they can tie into with their mobile device, whether it be a Chromebook or a laptop, etc. They can have interactive touch on the screen. They can have the markers and pens that work on the screen. They can work from the mobile device on those. So as they're collaborating and working together in groups on projects, they can then also display for not only others in their group, but also the others in the classroom. The 2 projectors you're speaking of are also interactive projectors, one on each side of one of the long walls, the interior wall. They are going to be hooked together, so if you have large presentations in there, whether that be with classes or even perhaps an organization or parents or whatnot, you can have a large presentation room. We also have a space set up with a little extra power, and or that would actually be for a green screen that they're going to put in one area of the room, because what you need for that is a little bit extra power for lighting, for video, etc., so that students can create. They can take their mind's eye to where it goes with regard to using a green screen. So it's really just an area that's going to be flexible with regard to the technology, but also the furniture, which is going to actually be something that the building administration and their flexible furniture team are putting together to fill the interior of the room as well. So we're pretty excited to see the final result of this room, and I think teachers are even more excited to actually get their classes in the room.
Anything else, Mr. Sanders? Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Bradford, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, for the approval to purchase equipment for Churchill High School Technology Collaboration Room 2013 bond. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson?
Yes, motion carries. That's going to be exciting.
Thank you.
That'll take us to item 8C, approval of agreement with Great Northern Consulting Group. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson?
Mrs. Burton.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve delegating to the superintendent or her designee the authority to enter into agreement with Great Northern Consulting Group, Ann Arbor, Michigan, for professional real estate services.
We have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mr. Centers. Mr. Francis.
Thank you. Livonia Public Schools is the owner of nearly 700 acres of land across the district. We have many parcels of land with many K-12 and pre- and post-secondary programs on them. However, we also have parcels of land that are vacant from schools past, and what the board is looking, what we're working on towards this Great Northern Consulting Group agreement is for the board to gain insight into the evaluation of 5 of the properties that the district owns, but does not currently have a program on site. 4 of the 5 don't even have a building on site, and the 5th is a vacant or empty, I shouldn't say vacant, but a building without any programs going on inside of it. So the proposal is for Mr. Bill Bowman from Great Northern, who has worked with the district in the past, and in the winter of 14-15 had done a similar evaluation on several properties, so the board would know what its assets are worth. And at this time, we're proposing 5 other properties to be reviewed by Great Northern, simply to give the board an idea of what the property's potential uses could be, what the current value is, and the board can use that information as it sees fits and move from there.
Thank you, Mr. Francis. Questions or comments from the board? Mrs. Burton.
About a year or so ago, for the benefit of the public who may not have been tuning in at that time, a year, maybe more than a year ago, we went out to the community and got input. I'm thinking about it, it's probably more than a year ago, a few years ago. Got input from the community on what kinds of things would they like us as a school district and as a school board to look at in order to preserve programs and to make the best use of our resources. Up near the very top, from a community across the board, was take a look at what we're doing with our vacant properties. This does not necessarily mean that the school board is going to be selling or even going to be engaging in selling these properties. But what we're going to do is at least take a look at them, find out what the value is, because in the 1960s, many buildings were built because most families had anywhere between 3 and 5 children, and that happened in almost every house up and down the block. That simply doesn't happen anymore. But we still have many of these buildings. In the 1980s, a good number of them were sold, and then piecemeal, some have been sold over time. But it remains that about 25% of the land that Livonia Public Schools owns is currently not used for K-12 purposes. The charge for this Board of Education is to utilize our resources wisely for our district, now and in the future. So what this board would need to do is take a look at properties and see not only are they being used now, but would they reasonably be used in the future? Because once our land is sold, it is sold. There are obviously not all the properties that we own are on this list, but these are some that we're going to at least take a look at. We don't want to alarm folks at saying these are going up for sale tomorrow, because that's not necessarily the case. I mean, it's not the case, period. Would they be sold in the future? May or may not happen, but right now the board is at least looking for information about what could they be used for, what is the approximate value of that land, and just see what is the wisest use of our resources. We are a school district, and we are charged with educating our students. As has been pointed out and discussed in many meetings, we are not a real estate holdings company. If we're going to potentially use it in the future, that is a very significant factor to consider. But right now, we don't want to alarm the community, but we do want to let folks know that we are looking at these resources and making sure that we're using them in the wisest way possible for our current and our future students in the district.
Thank you, Mrs. Burton. Well said. Any other questions or comments? Mrs. Jarvis.
In recent years, the price of real estate has gone up and down. I know that our homes are worth more than they used to be. It seems prudent to, every few years, evaluate what our land is worth, because that does change over time. I certainly like to keep on top of how much my house is worth, but that doesn't mean I'm going to run out and put it on the market. It's just part of being fiscally responsible. So I think that it's wise for the board to take this action.
Thank you, Mrs. Jarvis. Other questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mr. Centers, for the approval of agreement with Great Northern Consulting Group. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes, motion carries. Thank you. That will take us to item 8D, approval to purchase flexible furniture for Frost and Holmes Middle Schools, 2013 bond. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mrs. Frank.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the purchase of flexible furniture for Frost Middle School from Yo Computer Consulting and Interior Environments for $22,380.10, and for the Holmes Middle School from CWD for CDW for $39,959.71.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mr. Bradford. Mr. Willenborg.
Thank you, President Johnson.
And Mrs. Bradford.
Over the last 5 or 6 weeks, I've shared with you the diagrams and the pictures and the details of the flexible furniture plans at Frost and at Holmes Middle Schools. As a recap, at Frost, they've ordered several classroom pieces to include stand-up desks and flexible seating arrangements. They want to enhance their counseling area with some bench-type seating, and they want to renovate, if you will, redo their vestibule area with all types of alternative seating and tables. At Holmes, they also are going to have would like to purchase several classroom pieces like those stand-up desks, which are pretty popular. In the common areas on each side of the main office, they'd also like to redo those areas with all sorts of flexible seating arrangements and tables. And then in a group space room in the LMC, they'd also like to refurbish that with provide a more contemporary and colorful look. This funding, again, is from that secondary furniture budget of the 2013 bond. I recommend approval of the aforementioned flexible furniture plans for Frost and Holmes Middle Schools.
Thank you, Mr. Willenborg. Questions or comments from the board? Mrs. Burton.
Again, for the benefit of those who may not have been following along throughout our whole bond process, a certain number of dollars was allocated to each school for them to use as they saw best fit for their school environment, their students, what they had and what they thought would be useful. Gave a little bit of flexibility to each building, so in each building, this small portion of the budget is going to look different from building to building, but with a lot of latitude given to the building administrator and the staff in that specific community to use those dollars in the way that they saw would be the biggest bang for their buck, for lack of a better term. So that's why we'll see various formations or combinations of furniture coming through for this kind of purchase.
Thank you, Mrs. Burton. Other questions or comments? Mr. Willenborg, once this purchase is complete, where do we stand with our furniture budget?
It'll pretty much deplete the secondary furniture budget of that phase 3 of the secondary furniture plan.
Thank you. All right. So we have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mrs. Bradford,
Thank
for
you.
the approval to purchase flexible furniture for Frost and Holmes Middle School's 2013 bond. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Yes. Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson?
Yes. Motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
That will take us to item 8E, approval of financial statements for 2017, 2018. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson?
Mrs. Bonnefield.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the 2017-2018 audit report as presented by the audit firm of Plant Moran.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Burton. And Mrs. Smith, you will be helping us with that?
Thank you. Yes, President Johnson. I have the pleasure of going over a financial update with you before I turn it over to our colleagues from Plant Moran, who are our external auditors. So first, we'll take a look back at the 2017-18 school year to see how we did compared to what we budgeted. I am happy to report that our final budget amendment that was approved by the board had an accuracy rate of 99% in both the revenue and the expenditures. On the revenue side, revenues came in $1.5 million higher than we had budgeted for. The main driver in that was a reimbursement we received from Wayne Risa for our one-on-one parapros. The amount we received was higher than what we had budgeted. On the expenditure side, our expenditures came in $1.1 million less than what we had budgeted for, and the biggest driver there was in the salary and benefits category. What we had anticipated in severance payouts from staff retirements was lower than expected. So I wanted to break down, you can see back on this previous slide, that I've broken down between the local, state, and other sources of revenue, as well as on the expenditure side, salaries and benefits, purchase services, and supplies. So you can see it's kind of spread across each one of those categories. And on the next slide, I break down what are some examples of that can be found in each of those categories. In the local category would be things such as property taxes, as well as program fees from SAC or preschool, also earnings on investments. On the state side, this is where we recognize our foundation allowance we receive from the state and other restricted grant sources we get from the state, such as the 31A at-risk grant, Section 107 Adult Ed also comes through in that line. And then the other category encompasses a number of things, including the reimbursements from Wayne Risa for the one-on-one parapros I mentioned. We get a Medicaid reimbursement. This would also cover the incoming transfers from other funds that are generated from indirect costs. And then the expenditure side, salary and benefits are pretty straightforward. Purchase services covers a variety of things. These would be all of our contracted sub teachers, parapros, drivers. We also have legal expenses, transportation, telephone, mail, postage, a variety of things. Supplies are materials used in the classroom, as well as materials needed throughout the district, such as transportation supplies or maintenance supplies. And the last category is other. That's our capital outlays, such as equipment or vehicles, taxes written off, or transfers to other funds. So when we're taking a look at our budget, just as a reminder, I know that you know this, but legally we aren't allowed to expend any more than what's been authorized by our board. So when we do bring a final budget amendment for you, we don't yet know what all of our expenses are going to be, but we have to be conservative and have some foresight for things that might come up. So that explains why we have traditionally always come in under on the expenditure side on the budget. So now to actually take a look at the 18-19 school year to see how this will impact this coming school year, or our current school year. We anticipated having an ending fund balance of $19.9 million, and because revenues and expenditures came in better than anticipated, we ended the school year last year with a $22.5 million fund balance, and that's what will be reflected as our beginning fund balance for 2018-19 when we do our first budget amendment, which I anticipate bringing before the board for review in December. I would like to make note Of the $22.5 million, that about $1.9 million is already earmarked. This includes purchase of vehicles and buses that was approved by the board in April of 2018, as well as textbooks that were budgeted for in 17-18, and work with our textbook committee began in 17-18, but some additional time was needed, so we didn't anticipate using those funds until 2018-19. So again, I mentioned that our formal budget amendment will be coming before the board for review in December. At that time, I'll be updating the beginning fund balance, and at that time, we'll also have our final fall count for student enrollment, which will have an impact on our revenue. Also, when the proposed budget was approved, we didn't yet have all of our staffing in place for the 2018-19 school year, so we'll be able to update our staffing costs as well when we bring that amendment before you. So very, pleased. The district's, one of our district goals, of course, is financial stability. And I thank the board and the superintendent for the decisions that have put us in this better financial place. It wasn't very long ago that we saw a very different story. And we continue to look at the Michigan School Business Officials' recommendation of a 15 to 20% fund balance. We're not quite there yet, but we are definitely better than where we've been. And with that, I will invite my colleagues over. Tom Marchese and Lisa Vargo are here with us from Plant Moran. We met with them for our committee meeting just 2 weeks ago, and we went into some detail on the financial statements. And so tonight they'll do a summary for us of what we covered at the committee meeting.
Good evening. Thank you for having us here again today. So Tom's passing out some hard copies of the board presentations that we're going to be covering. So that's going to cover a lot of the financial highlights. Before I get into that, I just wanted to kind of take a step back and describe the couple deliverables that the board has received. So two of the most significant deliverables that the board has received would be, number one, our audit report, which is part of the basic financial statement. We will not be covering all that. As Allison said, we're going to really focus at the high level financial highlights. But what I do want to point out about that financial report is the opinion that's in there, because that's what you hire us to do, to put that opinion on that financial statement. So I'm happy to report that we were able to provide an unmodified opinion, which is the highest level of assurance that we can provide that your financial statements are free of material misstatement. The other significant report that the board has is the single audit report. So annually, we need to come in and we need to do federal grant testing, which is compliance testing, which means that we're following the federal guidelines and looking at specific grant rules as to what we're looking at. And again, on this report, we were able to provide an unmodified opinion as well. Again, highest level of assurance that your federal programs are being run materially correct. And also, just to report, when we do come in for audits, we do assess your internal controls. We do not test them, but we assess them. And I'm pleased to report that we did not have any material weaknesses, significant deficiencies, or anything that we felt rose to the level that we needed to report to the board that we felt needed to be corrected. So I do commend the finance department. That was fantastic. So with that, I'm going to go into the graph presentation. So this first table here represents all your governmental fund activity. GASB 34 requires that we kind of focus on what we term as the major funds. This year, the major fund is the general fund, your special education fund, sinking fund, and your bond series fund. This is consistent with last year. The general fund assets increased approximately $5 million from last year. Your liabilities remain consistent, and your fund balance increased by approximately $5 million. In the next few slides, we're going to go through the reasons for the increase to the fund balance. Your special education fund stayed consistent with last year. Both the sinking fund and the bond series fund's assets decreased from last year due to planned capital expenditure activity. The next graph, this graph or table, what we did here is we took the summary of the revenue and the expenditures for the general fund, and we compared it to the final amended budget. What we wanted to really focus here is show the accuracy of the budgeting in the finance department. So as you can see, if you look at the revenue line and the expenditure and other financing use line, the budget variance is less than 1%. That demonstrates very strong fiscal budgeting controls in the finance department. So I commend. That's wonderful. The next graph represents your general fund revenue for the period ending 2018. As you can see, the total revenue is approximately $156 million. The largest portion of the funding is the funding that comes from the state at approximately 74%. This includes the state portion of the foundation allowance as well as the categorical spending. As a reminder, included in the state revenue is approximately $13.5 million in funding from the retirement system. It's revenue that's coming in and going right back out. The state represents the largest portion of revenue, yet that revenue is really not in control of the school district. The next largest component is local revenue at $29.2 million, which represents mostly the property tax revenue. Other revenue at $6.1 million represents your special education funding. And then at $4.8 million is the enhancement millage, which is a 5-year millage that was approved by the voters. This represents Livonia's allocations of those funds, and it is based on your FTE student count, so every year the allocation could change. One thing that we did want to point out, included in your total revenues for the general fund, do include what we're going to term as kind of one-time revenues or potentially non-recurring type revenues. So anytime you have a sale of an asset or a sale of land proceeds, which you did this past year at about $400,000, that's a one-time revenue pickup into your fund balance. Also included this year, you had an additional special education fund transfer of approximately $460,000. As I described earlier, you have the that enhancement millage at about $4.8 million. It will recur next year, but it is an expiring revenue source, so we did want to point that out. And also, in addition, into your revenue from the state sources, as I said before, you have the Section 147C2 this year, which was a one-time deposit of approximately $2.2 million. It went right in and came right back out, so that had no effect on the fund balance. The next graph represents the general fund expenditures. So total expenditures this year were approximately $151 million. The largest portion, which you would expect when you have an organization full of people, would be your salaries and your benefits. When you add up your total salaries and your benefits, that comprises approximately 90% of your total expenditures. This is comparable to last year, and it is also what we see in most districts. The remaining expenditures and percents are consistent from one year to the next. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom to talk a little bit more about the GASB 68 and 75.
Thanks, Lisa. So this slide, I won't touch on all the bullet points, but the main takeaways here are that GASB 75 is new for the 17-18 reporting. It does not have an impact on the fund level. It only affects the government-wide statements. And it does not generally affect the district's rating. So GASB 68 and 75 relate to the underfunded retirement system, also known as MIPSers. Nearly all Michigan districts will show a deficit net position on their government-wide statements, but again, it does not impact the fund level. This next slide just illustrates that it solely impacts the government-wide statements with a zero impact to the fund level. So this chart shows the trend of general fund revenue and expenditures dating back to 2009. So you can see that over the course of time, the district has faced some tight finance situations, stemming back to 2009 and the draconian cuts of that of the government for the state aid. And moving into 2015, you can see that revenue does begin to exceed the expenditures, which prompted an increase in fund balance.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Just if someone's looking at this chart at home, this revenue does include those one-time revenues that we had highlighted in the previous slides.
Yes, Mr. Centers. So this represents your full general fund revenues and expenditures, including the one-time revenues.
Sure. If someone's looking at home, I didn't want them to be confused that perhaps that was our per pupil allowance that we're receiving. But it does consider other factors that the boards had made to bring some revenue into the district.
That's correct. It is in total.
Thank you.
Sure.
One other question, if I might, along the line of Mr. Center's question, that also includes the Wayne County Enhancement Millage, which is going to be a short term
That's
for the next
correct,
4
Ms.
years,
Burton.
and we will no longer, we may or may not be seeing that come to us again.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
So this next graph just illustrates what can be distinguished as an aging community. So you can notice a significant decline since 2009 in the state in the pupil counts for the district, starting with 17,000 in 2009 and moving down to 14,000 in 2018. So based on the pupil count decreasing, you saw on the prior slide that cost at the school district level are increasing. So the per pupil expenditure amount is increasing, which is consistent with trends we see across the state. And that pertains mostly to rising retirement cost. The retirement cost, for every dollar you spend in salary and wages, 37 cents for each dollar is added on for the retirement system. This next line graph just demonstrates the district's fund balance as a percentage of revenue, which is a key metric that's applied by the state. You can see that it's moved from about 6% in 2009 up to the current 14.36%. So it's commendable that the district is building these reserves. They'll be available to confront any unforeseen circumstances, and it adds to the financial stability of the district. Another key thought is potential new state leadership for the first time in 8 years, so no one can reasonably expect what is on the horizon for school finances.
So that concludes our financial highlight presentation. So we'd like to ask the board if they have any questions. I'd also like to just take one moment and thank Allison and management for all the hard work. It's a lot of work to pull all the information together for us to be able to put an opinion and gather all this information. So you have great support in your financial department, and they did a fantastic job.
Thank you, Lisa. Any questions or comments? Mr. Centers?
Excuse me, my voice is a little rough today. But I would like to thank our partners at Plant Moran for their professionalism and your thorough work, as always. It seems like the team here works very well with your team, and that's always great to see. This is also a great opportunity to thank Allison, and there's a lot of people that work in your office that we don't see on a day-to-day basis who we know work very hard, really have an attention to detail, and it really shows when the audit time comes around. So just want to say thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sims. Other questions or comments? Mrs. Burton?
A few. I was recently asked, why do we keep moving the fund balance, we as Livonia Public Schools? Someone had pointed out that our goal had been to get to 5% when we were just a few years ago at our lowest point, which was, according to this chart, and for my memory serves me well, also is between 2 and 3% fund balance, which is dangerously close. That would be dangerously close in anyone's household. It's certainly close when you're responsible for 15,000 students and 2,000 employees. But the question again was asked to me, why do we keep moving the target? That the target keeps to always be going out further and further and further. The target has always been, at least in my 9 years on the school board, that 15 to 20% is a healthy fund balance for a school district, so that you can weather storms that came to us just within these last 8 to 9 years, when we literally had $460 per student cut in October. after our staff was hired, after all of our expenses were set for the year. That equates to millions of dollars coming out of our budget midstream. We had to be prepared for something along that line, or any unforeseen circumstances when you're dealing with this large of an organization. The reason that we've had it look like we're moving this target is the target always was 15 to 20%, but when we got down in the middle of the recession to our lowest point of between 2 and 3%, to say that we're going to go to 15 to 20% the following year is just completely unrealistic. Therefore, we had the targets of, at first the target was 5% to get us out of the category of being an early warning district, which was warnings put out on us by the state of Michigan. Once we reached that, then the goal was going to be, let's get toward 10%, and then now the goal is let's get toward that 15 to 20%. So the target is not just a never-ending or arbitrary moving number, but the goal always has been to get to this 15 to 20%, which we are very close to getting to now. Not only would I like to thank Allison, our entire administrative staff, and our superintendent, but also those who came before those of us who are sitting in this room. We've had a superintendent prior to Mrs. Oquist. We had an administrative team that was comprised of several other individuals, and they did a lot of hard work along with the members of the Boards of Education during those years to make sure that we could make the difficult decisions, and they were not always fun or politically popular, but they made the decisions to get us through those very, very difficult recession years and keep as many dollars in our classrooms as possible, keep our programs strong for our students, and keep our community strong and our district strong. So I'd like to thank those who came before us who did a lot of that hard work so that we can be where we are today. Again, I'd like to thank you, Allison, to come in with a budget this size. Under 1% accuracy is absolutely amazing. You're to be commended, and as Mr. Center said, please thank those in your office, because it's not any one individual's work, but it's many. Thanks to all of our staff, too, who held to the budgets that we were all given to work within, and everyone has for many, many years now to try to get us back into a more comfortable position. And for those who may not have caught, Lisa, as you said, the retirement dollars that come in and out, especially in political years like these, we hear folks saying there's more money in education than there ever has been before, and yet we know as a public school district we have less dollars in our classroom than we have had in so many, many years. And what happens with that are two significant pieces. One is that, as you said, the retirement dollars go in and out, meaning the state of Michigan, back a few years ago, within the last 5 years or so, began supplementing our retirement costs, but not just paying it outright, but rather sending it to the school district, and we have to turn around and cut a check to that very penny and immediately send it back to the state of Michigan. While I'm very grateful for the assistance from the state of Michigan in helping to pay for that retirement cost, calling that education dollars, I believe, paints a false picture. Those are not dollars that for 5 minutes can land in our district or in our classrooms. Those are dollars, that check is cut, it's sent to Livonia Public Schools, that very same dollar amount to the penny has got to be turned around nearly immediately and sent right back to the state of Michigan. Therefore, Michigan can say, we spend more money on education, but those are not classroom dollars, and I wish people in our community would really understand that's what's happening. Until our retirement system has a major overhaul, it's going to continue with situations like these that are outside of our control. The other very significant piece to that, to the claim that more money is being spent on education, is the fact that community colleges and universities did not used to be allowed to dip their hand into the same pot as K-12 education. And they are, as of about the last 6 years or so now. It was going to be a one-time fix only. It's not. It's still recurring every single year. So not only do we have K-12 using that pie, we have colleges and universities that now can dip into the same pie, and we have an influx of money for retirement that's pulled right back out that's considered in that same pie, which is why two statements can be technically true, where there's more money going into education than there was before, and yet there's not anywhere near the number of dollars coming into our classrooms, because we have retirement community colleges and universities pulling out of that pie that never did before. So if you're in conversations with folks in your community, please try to pass this on. If that's just too much information, have them call a board member or superintendent. We can explain it pretty quickly. But it's very important to know why these two conflicting statements are out there and what's really happening in public education. If you are so inclined, please continue to encourage our legislators to properly fund K-12 education. Not just education on the whole, but properly fund K-12, to take a look at the adequacy study and see that we are not adequately funded to teach our kids the way we had been in the past. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Burton. Other questions or comments? Just to maybe expand a little on Mrs. Burton's point with regard to the fund balance, and it never has moved as a target. Please understand that regardless of where we are today at what I'm looking at 14.36%, that includes a lot of one-time revenue and the enhancement millage, which is may not be there in a few years. So although we were at that figure presently, a lot went into getting us there. That is a one-time revenue source. So if we didn't have those, and I think I've asked the question before, we'd be under 10%. So please keep that in mind. Any other questions or comments? Amy? Mrs. Bonnefield.
So one statistic, and I want to thank you guys last week, or at the committee of the whole, we grilled you guys on this stuff, so I appreciate you guys taking all the time and explanations at the committee of the whole meeting. But one statistic that I thought was really interesting is I believe with our fund balance, you noted that that's 7 weeks of operating funds. So while it seems like a really huge number to most of us, because there's a lot of zeros at the end of that, for our fund balance, really that's going to get us through, am I correct, 7 weeks operating week?
What it is, yeah.
Yeah. Should we stop getting any funding? It's going to be gone a very short period of time. I think that puts a little bit into perspective of what that number really means to our district. And again, I appreciate you guys last week, I keep saying last week, at our committee of the whole meeting, really taking on our questions and getting us a lot of answers.
We're here for it. You can call
Thank
us all
you.
during the year, too.
Thank you.
Any other
Thank you.
questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Burton, for the approval of financial statements for 2017-18. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Benefield says yes. Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
President Johnson?
Yes, motion carries. Again, thank you, Lisa and Tom, for being here tonight.
Thank you so much.
Have a
Thank
great
you, Tom.
evening.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
All right, that will take us to item 9, and item 9A is second reading of Board Policy JCDAE, Personal Communication Devices. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the Policy Committee and adopt board policy language for the attached document for Board Policy JCDAE, Personal Communication Devices.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mr. Centers. Mr. Willenborg, will you be helping us with this?
Yes, thank you, President Johnson. The policy previously referred to as electronic communication devices was written in 2004, and it addressed cell phones as demonic devices whose negative impacts far outweighed the beneficial. Our revised policy still prohibits accessing inappropriate websites and recording without permission, but it now recognizes PCDs, personal communication devices, as valuable instructional and learning tools whose authorized use is best left as a decision to that classroom teacher and the building administration. I recommend your support and approval of policy JCDAE.
Thank you, Mr. Willenborg. All right, any questions or comments on this policy? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mr. Centers, to accept and adopt board policy JCDAE, personal communications devices. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes, that motion carries. Thank you. That takes us to item 9B, second reading and adoption of board policy JCDAA, prohibited use of tobacco substances. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mr. Centers.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the Policy Committee and adopt board policy language per the attached document for board policy JCDAA, prohibited use of tobacco substances.
Support.
We have a motion by Mr. Centers, supported by Mrs. Bradford. And again, Mr. Willenborg will be helping us.
And again, thank you, President Johnson. Through our study session, through our committee of the whole meeting, and through the first reading, we've believed there a need to recognize this policy that was last reviewed in 2014. We wanted the new policy to reflect present-day and contemporary language, such as chewing tobacco, the use of e-cigarettes, and vaping mechanisms. That's what this new policy includes. The wording is different, and I appreciate your inputs and suggestions on its revision, and I recommend policy JCDAA for your support and approval this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Willenborg. Questions or comments from the board? Mrs. Bonnefield. Mrs. Burton.
That's okay. There's a lot of us up here. Just a word of caution for parents and imploring you to help out with vaping specifically. If you're not aware of it yet, we are very aware of it in our schools. It's the most recent danger to our secondary students. Vaping devices look like credit cards. They look like pens. They have no odor. They're difficult to detect, and our students are under the misguided impression that they are not harmful to them, but they are very harmful. Please be on the lookout for these items in your homes with your kids, with their friends, and assist in their health and assist the schools in trying to make sure that this is under control and that our students have some understanding and belief of the fact that these are harmful devices for them.
Thank you, Mrs. Burton. Other questions or comments? Seeing none, we have motion by Mr. Centers, supported by Mrs. Bradford, for the adoption of board policy JCDAA, prohibited use of tobacco substances. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll?
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes, that motion carries. Thank you, Mr. Willenberg, for all of your work on this, and I know that all of our cabinet works very, very hard on bringing amendments and changes to the policies, and the board really appreciates all the work.
And we appreciate your insights and inputs as well.
Thank you. All right, that will take us to item 9C, and this is the first reading of board policy DFKA, crowdsourced funding. And I understand Mrs. Smith is going to help us with this one.
Thank you very much, President Johnson. Over the last several years, crowdfunding has become an increasingly popular option for individuals to secure items for their classrooms. This policy was developed to give employees, volunteers, and agents of the district direction on the appropriate use of this fundraising source. And I want to thank the board. We were able to go over this policy in detail at our committee meeting, and thank you for the recommendations. We've incorporated that into the policy before you tonight.
Thank you, Mrs. Smith. Questions or comments from the board? Mrs. Burton?
One of the most important things, I believe, for folks to understand, both our staff or any volunteers or parents in our district, is that with this policy's passage, anticipating that happening in the next month at the next meeting, you would need to have approval from the building administrator before an LPS-sanctioned GoFundMe or such group fundraiser is taken upon. So that approval is necessary.
Thank you, Mrs. Burton. Other questions or comments? Mrs. Oquist.
Thank you, President Johnson. In addition to the board policy, our administrative team has also established detailed administrative procedures. Those administrative procedures highlight the process by which funds may be collected, accounted for, distributed, as well as accounting for the materials that are purchased with those funds.
Thank you, Mrs. Oquist.
You're welcome.
All right, then we will put this, as long as everybody's in agreement, we'll put this on for the second reading at next month's regular meeting.
Yes.
All right, then that will move us on to item 9D, first reading of board policy GAC, staff job-related accidents/injuries. Mr. Archibald, hello.
Good evening, again. Yes, you may recall from our discussions at the study session as well as the committee of the whole meeting, in reviewing related administrative procedures pertaining to job-related accidents and injuries, we noticed that we did not have a corresponding board policy under which those procedures fit neatly and in a logical way. And so as such, we established a very brief and concise policy, which is before you tonight for consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Archibald. Questions or comments from the board? And we would note as well that this indicates that there are administrative procedures that this relates to as well, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. All right, if there are no questions or comments on this and the board is satisfied, we'll put this on for second reading at the next regular meeting. Then we'll move us to item 9E, and that is first reading of Board Policy GAEA, discriminatory harassment of employees or applicants for employment. And again, Mr. Archibald.
Yeah, if I may just highlight the two key changes that are both indicated in the second paragraph of this policy. The first one is a simple clarification in to whom a report or complaint of harassment should be made. The language clarifies that. In addition, a new statement to that paragraph, it's now also the responsibility of an administrator who is aware of such circumstances to report possible harassment to the appropriate administrator.
Thank you, Mr. Archibald. Questions or comments from the board on this policy? Seeing none, this again will be put on for a second reading at our next regular meeting. And then we will go to 9F, first reading of Board Policy GAF, Workplace Violence. Something Mr. Archibald knows about?
No comment. But I do know the changes in this policy, and these are simple title changes to correct or to be current with the titles for the positions noted in this policy.
Thank you, Mr. Archibald. Questions or comments from the board? Mrs. Burton.
Just a typographical thing here. In the fourth bullet down, looks like we intended to strike out TELE on telephone to make it phone, and it just still remains there right now. So by the time it comes up for a second reading, we'll need to have that removed.
Thank you, Mrs. Burton. We'll take care of that.
All right, any other questions or comments? All right, seeing none, then we will move and put that on for a second reading at the next, Mrs. Bonnefield.
It was afterwards. We went through some pretty heavy policies. I don't know if, President Johnson, if you can maybe ask someone to provide an explanation what the difference between the policies, and we talked about administrative procedures and what our responsibility is, and explaining that what the administrative procedures are and the difference between our policy and the day-to-day operations and how those are taken care of, because as Mrs. Burton always points out, for the public's information, it may seem like we skim our policies are briefer than they maybe we should be. Some people might think that it might be, and that how the administrative procedures work, and just a little bit about that. We've got some pretty big deal policies going right now, and it might be worth a quick explanation.
So you're thinking about an explanation between the policy and the administrative procedure?
Yes, and who's responsible.
Anybody want to take a shot at that?
Be happy to, unless Superintendent Oakes would like to.
Do you want to start, and I'd be happy to join in?
I will. I've done policy for a long time, so policy basically says what the board directs to happen. The board needs to write or assist with the writing of the policy itself. It comes typically to a study session, then a committee of the whole. It has to go through a first and second reading, and after that second reading is it voted upon. So it's typically at least 4 sessions that the board will look at policy in basically what that's saying what the board is desiring to happen, such as the workplace will be free of violence. The administrative procedures are how it's going to happen. And that is more of day-to-day operations, and therefore that portion is turned over to our superintendent and administrative team and staff to handle the administrative procedures and perhaps any corresponding exhibits, or which would be forms that will be used. But the what is to happen is the policy, and that's the responsibility of the board. How it happens, like everything else in our district, is the responsibility of our superintendent and administrative team. Therefore, administrative procedures are in a little more detail typically. They're brought forward for the board's information only, because that's our superintendent's responsibility to handle. You want to take that and run with it?
That was great, Mrs. Burton. I will acknowledge that in addition to the minimum of 4 meetings through which these policies are discussed, we often take time to also review state and federal guidelines and laws, as well as legal references. There may be times when we speak with our legal counsel, the representatives in our school, in addition to taking a great deal of input from our Board of Education. And so we are in the process of continuously reviewing the board policy. I believe in many of these were updated in 2014, which is not that long ago, and many do not require significant changes. But as you may note, some of these policies, in just a short period of time, require pretty deep and extensive review to be sure that they're not only aligned with current state and federal laws, but also with district practices. And so sometimes those changes are required within the board policy, which then is required to go through the formal approval process. And sometimes those changes are more appropriate for the administrative procedures, which although it does not require board approval, we certainly do bring before the board each and every one of those changes to be sure that the board is aware of the administrative procedures that we will be following to carry out the policies set by our Board of Education.
Thank you, Mrs. Oquist.
That was
I think.
good.
And again, I should point out that although we did as a board go through, and there are 2 huge binders that we went through item by item a couple of years ago, our policies are not static. They are dynamic. Circumstances change, and our cabinet partners are well attuned with those policies, and they keep an eye on them as well. It's not an easy job, and it's never ending. And we as a board really appreciate everything that cabinet does to bring those items to our attention, because you deal with them on a day-to-day basis, and you can see them. We see them we see them all the time, but not as in-depth as you do. So thank you for all the work that you guys put in to help us with that. So that last policy will be on for a second reading in our next regular meeting. That will then bring us to item 9G, and as this has sort of gone through a metamorphosis over the years as to how we do that, we are back to hearing from our board members. And at this point, I will open it up for anyone who has additional comments. Mrs. Jarvis.
Thank you. I just would like to take a moment, President Johnson, along with my colleagues and our friends on the administration, and wish our superintendent a very happy birthday.
Thank you. Birthday. Other than my family, there's no one else I would represent. It was very happy to be here with all of you this evening.
Dan is going to sing for us.
That will be a treat. Thank you so much. Very grateful for all of you.
Mr. Senish.
Just expanding on what Mrs. Oquist said, I already have my team for Blessings bowling, so I consider the trophy already wrapped up. That being said, bring the competition on. I'm ready for it. That's all I got.
Thank you, Mr. Senish. Mrs. Bradford.
Thank you, President Johnson. I just wanted to let the community know that several of our board members this weekend will be attending the Michigan Association for School Boards annual conference. So while maybe not every one of us is going, I know we always take our board duties and learning seriously, and so we all try to partake in these activities. So we'll be to Grand Rapids this weekend, and we hope to bring back some great information and learn more about school board policies and good stuff. So we're doing that this weekend.
Thank you, Mrs. Bradford.
Thank you for your time.
Other questions or comments? No?
No.
If that's the case, then we are at the end of the agenda, and I would just like to say goodnight to Eunice and George, if they're watching. And is there any more business to be brought before the board tonight? If not, then we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.